So maybe I'll just kick us off and yeah, welcome you all to this space that we're going to share with Will Ruddick, who's joining us from Kenya. I'll just briefly introduce things, and some others will probably join as we're speaking. I think there was about 20 or so signed up online. So yeah, maybe some more will join. But it's yeah, thanks for being here, and nice to see familiar faces, familiar names, and yeah, I'm excited for this conversation. So just want to quickly introduce Will. So Nadia Johannesova and I invited Will to join CERN earlier this year, and we were delighted that he accepted. And I thought this Liviana would be a good opportunity for people in the network to have the chance to chat with him about his work, learn about what he's been doing. Um, I guess principally under this term commitment pooling. Um, and yeah, and I think if there's anyone who has worked hard to sort of expand economic imagination and to shake things up in how we think of the economy, it's Will. And he's a really interesting guy. He's got a background in physics. He spent over 15 years working to merge ancient ancestral practices with digital technologies in East Africa. He works primarily with marginalized communities, forgotten communities in refugee camps and informal settlements. Um, and yeah, and his work on decentralized community economies has been oriented around ROLAs as well. So these are rotating labor associations. So I suppose we'll learn more about these, and it's proving inspirational. Not just around Africa, but also around the world. For example, in Jackson, Mississippi, where Will has been recently working with Cooperation Jackson. Um, yeah, and finally, earlier this year, he published a book called Grassroots Economics: Reflection and Practice, which I highly recommend. It's a really practical book. It's free to download. It's full of wisdom, and Will also writes very frequently on Substack and is very active there, and is always sending out very enriching sort of yeah texts and writings. So let me see. There's just eight of us in the room, so I might, if it's okay, I'll briefly, as we sometimes do during Liviana sessions, briefly ask us to introduce ourselves with sort of just where we are in the world and maybe uh, why we're here or um, why this session interested us, if that's okay, and we'll pass it on to someone. So, for example, I'll quickly pass it to Ben, and then Ben can pass it on to someone else, and we'll go around in a circle in this way. So we just have some familiarity with who's in the room. Feel free to turn on your cameras or not as you feel comfortable. And yeah, Ben, would you like to jump in?
Hi, thanks Tom for the introduction here, and yeah, really glad to be here. My name is Ben. I'm located in Freiburg in Germany, in the very southwestern corner, and I'm here because I'm really interested in the topic overall about how like more collaborative, cooperative approaches can kind of turn things around and create more momentum and power, basically, for transformation. And with that, I would pass it on to Bianca.
Hello, I'm Bianca. I'm located in Cologne, and I'm a new member of the CERN network. So I was quite keen to jump into the first session here and to get like a more practical lens from you, Will. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the session, and I will throw the ball to you, Sophia.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sofia. I'm based in Proaza, rural territory of Asturias in the north of Spain, and I work in a research center and eco-museum called La Ponte. And yeah, this topic for me has always been very interesting, and I'm very looking forward to learn from Will and his very interesting background. I will pass it to Vaya. Vaya?
Hi everyone. Thanks, Sophia. I'm Bhavya. I'm joining from Sydney, so it's 9 o'clock. But I was very keen on this session. I joined CERN about 6 years ago when I started my PhD with Catherine Gibson and Stephen Healy. So that's how I became part of CERN. But it was also because I was following community economies work for the longest time because I work with indigenous single women farmers in India, and we do collective agriculture on common leased plots of land. So there's lots of grassroots activism component and decolonial scholarship that I've been working around. So I'm really interested in the session. So that's why I'm here. Can I pass it on to Marcus?
For sure. I'm Marcus. I'm calling, or I'm here from Leipzig in Germany. I actually have no idea so far about commitment pooling systems. I often heard it, so this is one part of these diverse economies that I have little knowledge about. So I'm just here to get a bit of input on this, and I'm very sorry to put off the camera because I use the chance also to do a bit of housework in the meantime. With that, I would pass on to Abis.
Was that me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Aviv. I'm calling from Hull, which is a city sort of the north west of England. What am I supposed to say? Also, how I got involved in CERN, or why am I here?
Sorry, Aviv, we're just discussing, it's just something about why you're at the session, why the session interested you, or what took your...
Well, I'm working mostly in neighborhoods, stigmatized neighborhoods, and places where there's very little resources, and I'm involved in all sorts of economic projects here, like trying to make something out of nothing, and the description made me curious, so I came. And I passed it on to someone has to help me who hasn't spoken it. Sorry, I'm a bit late.
I think we have Nadia or Songzi, or Nadia would be best, because...
Oh, okay.
Nadia, then.
Hi, I'm Nadia. Sorry, I joined just now from Czech Republic, and I think Tom probably already mentioned that we wrote a case study of Will Ruddick's project in our upcoming book, and we found it really interesting. So I'm here hoping to learn again a bit more or have an update on how it's going, actually. So that's all from me, I guess. And who hasn't spoken yet?
Yeah, I think that's everyone, Nadia, at this point. We're just waiting on an intro from Songzi, who's in the library, but that's okay. And yeah, Will, I'll pass it to you. I'd sort of said when talking with Will that maybe we could pass it to him for 20 to 30 minutes to discuss his work and then open the conversation. And it seems like there's lots of people here who will have relevant experiences, so I'm sure we'll get chatting afterwards. So thanks, Will.
Okay, thanks. Good to be here. Hi, Tom. Hi, Nadia. Okay, let me share screen and I'll kind of talk through some basics and then kind of get into where we are today with all this stuff. Let's see. Slideshow. Can you see that? Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
So this is I'm calling from where I live here in a village on the coast of Kenya. These are most of my neighbors and some of the team that we work with. We do like all the stuff that we work on, we practice ourselves. And so that's kind of, it's like a think and do tank. And then when we get stuff that we think is kind of useful, we push it out as open source software. And so I'll show you where that's gotten to. And a lot of the work, I mean, when I first got into this stuff, I was leaving physics, going into economics, and I was very interested in just how people cooperate. And I fell very in love with, community currencies and that lineage of thought. And I came out here and tried to kind of replicate things like Curitiba, Brazil, like the Cambio model and Berkshires, and kind of went through a lot of different types of models with groups for years and years. And we kind of had settled on something like a voucher model where people or groups could express commitments for resources in the form of something like a gift card. And we started with little paper vouchers. And so groups or individuals would make gift cards kind of backed by usually shillings worth of services, but it didn't have to be shilling based. It could be other things like hours or, quantity of materials. And And we would create kind of markets with those things and get people to trade them with each other. And that was kind of, as far as I understood the model, as far, you know, I'd studied it maybe since 2000, and with pretty good results. I mean, we ended up going to jail at one point with the Kenyan government, and we won our court case because the system was kind of working so good that people are trying to bribe the police with these little vouchers and things like that. In Kenya, there's a lot of corruption and stuff, um, and winning that court case kind of brought a lot of communities around Kenya to want to kind of replicate what was going on in slums at the time with these models. And we got to the point where printing paper vouchers was just way too much work, and costly to have kind of security printing on these things and whatnot. So we went to a digital system. We integrated it with mobile phones. With the telecoms. So you could dial a little code and you'd end up with a little menu. Even on a phone without internet, you could get a little what's called USSD menu. And we had some scares again with government. We decided, well, we should move the whole back end to a blockchain just as the database, so that if we are taken down somehow, that we have there's redundancy there. And so that was the idea with the blockchain. It's just really initially just as redundancy, you know, for security, that there were more nodes than just us. And we went from small little tiny blockchains, tried to build our own at one point, and finally when it ended up as a validator on Celo, which is a very small blockchain with about 60 validators around the world. That was doing carbon offsetting and all kinds of other kind of interesting kind of network of kind of community that was using a common ledger together. And then what we noticed in about 5-6 years ago was that the groups that were using these types of digital vouchers, once we started being able to see, you know, kind of anonymized data on the blockchain of what was moving through that blockchain, we saw some groups that were doing something like 20 times more than everyone else in terms of volume, and also getting reports that they were building farms. And so the question is, like, what were they doing? It didn't look like a market anymore. And what we found was a super, super ancient tradition. And that's what we describe as ROLAs in academia, rotational labor associations. But I knew nothing of it really. And you know, every language in the world seems to have a term for these. Even like the British, or like the Celts would have called them bees, BEE. I mean, every culture in the world has some various forms of this. And so we tried to basically work with elders and kind of pull out what were the fundamentals of that. How does it really work? And, you know, it's described by a lot of authors as something like a gift economy, or just, you know, friendship circles or mutual aid. But it was like, well, what actually constrains and holds that together? What does that look like? And so this is kind of a toy model of how that can work. So if you imagine that people are, imagine this is just social memory here in the middle, and these are 3 neighbors. And these 3 neighbors are committing to supporting each other over a harvest season. And each one of these, let's say, represents, let's say, a day's worth of commitments, right? So this family is saying, I'm willing to offer this many days worth of commitments. The thing is, you know, like, tracking this back, there's many, many forms of memory in which this could have lived in, kind of relational memory, emotional memory, reputational systems, right? But essentially, there's some trackability between the memories of these people, that there's some group memory of these commitments of everyone in the community. And those commitments might not even be said out loud as well. So there's many, many forms you can play around with this. And you could say, well, based on this track record and history, this family could say, I need everyone to help me, right? So they say, okay, everybody help me. And what's actually happening is they go into debt into the community, at least reputational debt, like more of their commitments are outstanding. And these guys are fulfilling their commitments. Okay, so if you imagine that this is really, you know, it actually translates fairly easily to something like a mutual fund or a credit union, where these are assets. You can think about these as assets. They represent obligations of the issuers. These could be all kinds of assets. These could be commitments for money even, right? Well, so these guys are there. This person's is doing what we call usually a swap, right? So they're putting in something like collateral into this kind of escrow account. I'm switching into financial language here. And there's a lot of, it's fun to go through the mapping back and forth into different types of language around these systems. But they're essentially pulling out resources and they're using them. So it's like pulling out a gift card and using it with this family. And this family is helping them build this hut. And so is this family. And so these guys are in less relational debt compared to them, right? So these guys have a lot of debt in the community right now because they've got this thing built, right? And then it goes around, right? Usually this is why it's called rotating labor associations. It goes around to here, it's their turn, right? These people do the same thing. They swap to borrow assets and they use them to pay for services or resources from these communities. And finally, these guys do it as well. And we've actually gone back to settlement, right? There's nobody owes anything to anybody anymore. It's back to how it started, right? But huts have been built. Okay, so this is also can be considered like a basic credit and debt system. You can look at this on the surface layer as kind of like a mutual credit system. But what's under that mutual credit system is some form of accounting for commitments and reciprocity. Okay, so we've used this as a model, and there's all kinds of constraints for this model, like how much can this family borrow from everyone else within the season, right? What happens if they don't pay back? Like imagine they got this hut built, but then they never help anyone else out. What are all those constraints, right? So we came up with protocols around this, and this is actually not in Kenya where I am, but we visited some groups in Uganda, and this small group of women, it represents each one of these women represents another about 15 groups. It's kind of like a super cluster here. They built this house behind here. They do all kinds of this work for forever, for generations and generations, for as far back as they can. They even just within one region, they have 4 different language group names for the exact same tradition. That's how old it is. In fact, the names for these traditions seem to be group nouns, like group pronouns, like a flock of humans. You would say Amweria of the Giriama, right? Amweria being like the actual name for a grouping of people, a group, like the word group in their language is these practices, right? And so these guys represent, we were doing like envelope calculations, but about 10% of the entire GDP of the economy of Uganda could be represented just by their labor within 1 year, not even the assets that they build, right? So there's huge amounts of beautiful efforts, and they're building skills. There's togetherness, there's laughing, there's usually food sharing at these events. There's everyone gets a chance to kind of have their voice heard because they get to manage their own areas and call them as a community. There's infrastructure being built, like it's all these kind of integral types of common resources are being built in these systems, and it's beautiful human habitat. It's wonderful to be part of. We do them 10 times a week in our little village here. And everyone's getting houses built. Everyone's extremely happy about being part of these systems. Refugee camps, like it's been really revolutionary to work with Red Cross around this, and I'll share with you some articles recently about that. So what's the basic protocol? And we'll get into talking more here. But basically, you have something like something that holds memory here of what's being offered by whom. You have some sort of curation of what's allowed within any particular pool. And you can imagine this pool is something that could be created or used by any form of an agent, right? An agent could be a person, it could be a family, it could be a group of neighbors, it could be a business, it could be anything that has agency could specify these are the things that they offer or want, right? So think of these as like your list of offers and wants. This is how you value those things. This can be expressed in a lot of different ways. So you could do it against the national currency. You could do it against time. You could do relative value. There's many ways to express. Think of this as like gene expression, right? These are really interfaces is what we call them in technology. And then you have some form of limitation, like what's the maximum amounts of things that could be in there? Well, how do you create balance? Or how much can, if someone's holding these A's, how many A's can swap in here before they have to be pulled out again? Are there any limitations on that stuff? There can also be exchange logic. Like if you're playing around with, we do a lot of work with syntropic agroforestry people and biomimicry, and we talk about like mycorrhizal fungal networks, right? So if you imagine this as a big fungus that's enabling resource flows between different plants, with different types of minerals. Well, they're eating 25% of that those nutrients to survive, right? So the exchange function could have all kinds of caveats, scheduling, fees. This is kind of like your business logic in some sense. So that protocol seems to be mapped fairly well for a lot of kind of living system resource coordination networks. It's really a simple kind of, in some ways, an abstraction, but it really captures a lot of utility. And when used as a protocol language now, think of like TCP/IP on the internet, like how do you actually communicate across networks of pools, right? Like a mycorrhizal network is not just one big mycorrhizal. It's a huge number of these nodes. You get into routing systems. And you end up with systems that look like this. If you go to, this is our public open source that anyone can use. And people are using this in Ukraine, all over the world now, mostly still in Kenya, but more and more in Brazil and a few other countries like Italy, where you have each node here is a different person in the network or an agent in the network. And you can actually see how they're interacting with each other. Each color here is a different pool or offering, and you can see them kind of connecting through things like supernodes. Those would be pools in the network. So there's a lot of data. So if you have researchers that want to do any sort of data analysis, that's always beautiful. And we also have researchers that come in and do long-term kind of immersion visits with us. With indigenous communities and rural communities, refugee camps and urban communities, and always that we learn a lot that way as well. It's always been, we almost always have 1 or 2 a year. Generally just trying to create connections between people and their resources and enable them to exchange with each other, just like we're exchanging right now, without being forced to use a centralized medium of exchange that's been captured. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of colonialism and monetary systems and where these things sit in capitalism and the current systems. But I'll leave it like that, and we can have more discussion. That's my Substack again. There's a free audiobook there, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And yeah, thank you, Nadia, as well, for helping edit that book. It was a huge thing that you helped with. Let me stop there.
Great. Thanks so much, Will, for that, brief insight into, I think, what is a very complex topic and how this is practiced in different communities and how the technology is used and engaged with. And I'm sure there are questions and comments. So if anyone would like to drop one in the chat or just unmute yourselves, please feel free. Yeah, I'll leave us for a minute just to consider. So Marcus.
Thanks, first of all, Will, for this super nice presentation. Just also about the everyday life, maybe I missed this point because I was lost for 1 minute. How does it work in the everyday life? Like, there's the Sufaru network. Is this something that every person has on a mobile phone, or how would it work also on the everyday, let's say it like this, and how often do people use it? And the second thing that I'm interested is with this valuation and limitations. So how do you do that?
Sure. So in Kenya, most everyone's using a very simple little, like, what's called USSD interface. It's a little bit like SMS. So they dial a little code and they end up with a little menu. And that little menu basically will show you them how much credit they have on the network, and then they can send that. There's a few other functions that they can access as well on there. But basically, it's very similar to how people here in Kenya use e-money systems as well. Very similar interfaces. We also have things like little QR codes for people who don't have phones at all. Somebody will have to log them in, and we also have like little things like these kind of like little NFC cards and things like that. We do these at like festivals and things like that. So that's it. And the website that I showed, or I haven't showed you much yet, but sarafu.network, that's more for people who have either smartphones or internet access, and we're working on an Android app as well. And there's a lot of things we're working on this year to basically kind of what's called account abstraction, where basically people can do things like Google login or username and password, and they don't have to use the blockchain. Just because that's you end up having to get extra wallets and things like that for that. It ends up being a pain in the butt for people sometimes. So that's a big push this year. So in terms of like everyday use, think of it a little bit just like having a credit card. And so basically you've got gift cards that you issue yourself as Marcus, right? So you have like, let's say, and how do you value those? So let's say you value them as, let's say, euros worth of your consulting hours or your research work. Okay, so you say, okay, I've got these. You could just use those as a gift card. Like people could buy them off of you, could give them out to your family, right? That's just a little digital object that can move around. Okay, just like a little digital gift card. If there's a pool now, so that's like a community group or you yourself have created a pool, that's an object for you to say, I'm going to put some of my gift cards in there, right, to hold them. And I'm going to say, I would allow other types of resources to come in to pull those out, right? You're going to allow swaps to happen. So you could say, I'm going to allow dollars to come into my pool to pull out my gift cards. Well, you've just made a little vending machine, right? So it's like the very simplest form of pool is just that, right? But if you start to allow multiple assets into your pool, well, they can also start to cross-exchange with each other, and you create more and more of an exchange, right? Then if you imagine you have a network of these, you can have routing through that entire network. So, right, I could jump between 5 pools to reach whatever shop I'm at, or you know, to work with Tom. So like so there's a few things going on. There's things like market days and just normal exchange going on, you know, that you would see in kind of a normal marketplace. And then you have these kind of rotating labor groups mixed into that, and then you have kind of lending groups as well mixed into that as well. And usually the rotating labor groups are meeting once or twice a week. And what they'll do is the host, let's say Tom's the host, says, everyone, I want you to come to my house, and he's going to give them credit on the network, right? So he ends up in debt to the network, right? Just like that first diagram there. And then he's going to earn that credit back. He won't have, he'll be capped, right? So depending on the pools he's part of, that's how much credit he has. That's his limit in the network, right? And that limit is usually based on things like, there's things like 1-to-3 ratios is really common. So like a typical savings and loan group, if you deposit something like $100 worth of your assets, you get to borrow $300 from the group, right? So that's very, very common. But in this case, Tom, let's say, is gone into that network. He says, okay, I've created my Tom vouchers. The community says, okay, they're good. We like Toms. Okay, great. And they say, Tom, put in $100 worth, or in this case, maybe, you know, 1,000 shillings worth of your commitments into the pool, and we're going to grant you access for 3 times that. You can use that now to call on your muerias, or even do it asynchronously. It doesn't have to be in just mueria. Mueria is the term where I live here. Sorry for that, Rotational Labor Association. That's a MWERIA. So yeah, I think I got all your questions there.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, cheers.
So we've got Ben, then Sophia, then Javier.
Yeah, thanks, Will. This is really, really interesting, all the insights that you gave us. I was wondering, because you were also mentioning some legal issues that you yourself faced, because it seems like those systems are under quite some pressure, I could think of, because they do, I mean, they kind of provide a way to circumvent some of the more structural limitations, of course, and they can be quite emancipatory. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the pressures, be they political or legal, or maybe even economic, that these systems face.
Well, okay, let me be abstract for a second here, just because I enjoy this topic. The Roman moneta, right, where we get the word money from, is a tradition, right? Like the Romans, you know, piggybacked on other traditions, but basically they'd go into towns and villages and say, "We'll protect you as long as you pay us in these tokens, these coins." And they were, you know, stamped in the mint, where the Romans had captured that mint, and you could only get these by working for the Romans. right? So they would go out to these places and say, all of your exchanges, we want you to use them in these, and we're going to tax you in these as well for everything you do. And if you don't pay those taxes, we're going to destroy your town. And if you do pay them, we'll protect you from the barbarians and stuff like that. So it was kind of a rudimentary form of commitment. So we wrap money under a type of commitment, and specifically money as a tradition has been very useful for me, right? So if anyone asks me to define money, I just say, well, it's a tradition, just like Christmas is a tradition, right? If there was a Roman alive today, they would say you're using the same name, money, for the exact same thing that we did, and basically statewide issuance of a commitment that's enforced through taxation. Pays standing armies, very, very, and so that tradition went into the imperial, feudal systems as Rome broke up. It went down into the imperial systems and the colonial systems into the nation states, right? We've inherited it. We even call it the same thing in most of the world, money. So to me, that helps a lot in terms of just framing stuff. And so what does that tradition look like when it came into Kenya? And that's, what I experience and know the most from, because that's not even that long ago here, right? We're talking in, the independence here was just in the 60s. And so what happened was that there was a lot of Arab training coming in, a lot of spices, mostly sugar, and sugar being so desirable that you would sell, and fight with neighboring groups to sell slaves to the Arabs and other stuff. And then coinage came in. So when I ask people where money came from, they'll say, well, the first time our grandparents ever heard of it or saw it was paramende, which is sweets to buy sugar. And so they could, instead of paying with slaves, they could pay with coins or colonial script eventually. And then the colonists came in and said, look, we're going to get rid of slavery, but we're going to enforce the Roman taxation model. And they called it hut taxes. And so they had to work on the Christian plantations to get these the hut tax paid for. And if they didn't work for the British, they would get beaten up and pulled into these camps, right? So wage slavery replaced it. And so the systems of kind of mutual aid like this, the rotational labor associations, they gradually shifted, not even very gradually, over maybe a 1 generation span, into savings and loan, what are called ROSCAs now in academia, rotating savings and credit associations, where they've just replaced their commitments, right, those things in the basket, with national currency, which were commitments of the state. You can think of it, maybe not a very nice commitment of the state, but still a commitment nonetheless. And so, that was considered okay by the government. You don't pay taxes in those types of systems, by the way. And this is quite interesting because what you're doing is consecutive borrowing. And this is as well how Trump takes his salary. And a lot of elites also work this way. And a lot of corporations work the same way. They use internal credit systems to move around resources internally or within networks, right? They don't use money to move their bottles from factory to factory. That'd be ridiculous, right? But it's not ridiculous for normal people. We have to use money for everything, right? Because we better pay taxes on it. But once you get up into the elite corporate and political echelon, you're always dealing with credit networks, and you never pay tax within those networks, right? That's why they're efficient. And so the technology, as you were, of mutual aid credit networks moved up into the elites, right? And it's perfectly legal. So if you borrow against your income, well, you don't pay tax on borrowed money, do you? And so if we're all borrowing against each other, right? Well, then even right now, like if we say that we are mutually borrowing from each other right now, well, then we don't pay the government anything. But if you say that this interaction right now is transactional, I say, Tom, I'm giving you $1,000 right now of services. Right now, I'm giving you guys a great lecture. You owe me all $1,000, and you're going to pay that back by doing research for me in the future. If we just formulate what we're doing as that, it's illegal. It's actually illegal to even say that. Think about it. It really is. If you go to France right now and you say, I'm doing a professional service worth $1,000 and you're going to pay me back in kind later with $1,000 of your research services, illegal. Totally illegal, right? You have to pay tax on that, right? If we're not paying the euro tax on it, it's totally illegal. And a lot of barter networks, a lot of like mutual aid groups, a lot of community currencies that use transactional models are FUCKED because of that, right? They're totally not functional because they're in a transactional. They're trying to be what? They're trying to be the Roman money, right? This is why, this is why I got as far away from monetary theory and monetary alternatives and community currencies as possible. We've thrown those words out the door. We never use them because it puts us into the Roman model. It puts us into money. And if you're trying to recreate money, it's like trying to recreate Christmas. Like they own that model, right? That's their tradition, right? And we're within that tradition. And if you're going to use transactional systems, well, that's it. It's that system is made to tax you on transactional interactions. So what do you do instead? You say, oh, well, actually, we're going to pool resources and we're going to continually borrow them from each other, right? It's totally legal. It's amazing. And it's done everywhere around the world already, right? And so this is, one of the benefits of us also working with like indigenous communities is like, well, you can actually point to these traditions. They've been around forever. Right. So to make them illegal now and say, oh, no, like even our interaction right now, how much money is it worth? And somebody's going to go report to the government, oh, that conversation was worth $100. Where's the taxation, Tom? Right. So that's what we're trying to get out of that type of colonialization, right? This kind of capture of the medium of exchange, because the problem with a medium of exchange being a thing, right, is that it's easily to capture, right? That's what money is. It's a thingification, right? It's a commodification of the medium. But the medium, in our point of view, is meant to be language and protocol, right? It's a space of exchange, right? And so you can think of the object itself, like the token or a piece of money, as a form of commitment. But the pool is what holds and enables exchange and flows through those things. And for the longest time, I spent 10 years focused on the thing, the token, the money, right? Trying to say, oh, no, Tom, you can make a currency. Everyone can make a currency. And it's like, okay, yeah, everyone can also have a butthole. So what, right? What do we do with all that? How do we actually connect it all together? And so that, I think there's something really powerful about commitment pooling in that sense. And we've used that term because we couldn't find another universal term that was just, like talking about the pooling of commitments and all of these traditions, because there seems to be a different name for every language. So anyways, we've written a lot of legal due diligence. We've worked with a lot of lawyers. We have a little like license when you create a pool that says this is not for tax evasion. This is not for replacing income. It's a mutual aid group where you're mutually borrowing resources from each other, right? Like, and there's as long as there's a ledger to prove that, it's actually good that it's transparent in that sense. So you can actually show that, yes, we all chipped in some resources. We're all borrowing those from each other. We're all paying them back to each other. And if money is going into those networks, it's just an endowment, right? Just the same as any mutual aid group, right? They pool money together as well. So that's knock on wood, and this is a lot of this is just it's a language war, right? Because depending on how we define our interactions, we end up within some enclosed regulatory framework, right? And so my hope is that what we're really just trying to do is take this language, these protocols, it's really ancient stuff, and just make it really obvious and easy for everyone to use. And so you just end up being part of a big federated credit network, right? And we use the term cosmo-local a lot, right? You're connecting from local out bioregionally into these networks. Yeah. Is that good, Benedict?
Yeah, amazing. Thanks.
Sophia?
Hello, thank you, Will, for the presentation. And well, actually, my question was a little bit similar to Ben's, but not about what is like illegal or not illegal. For me, it's a little bit funny because I come from Latin America, and in my country, Guatemala, 60% of our economy is completely informal. That means illegal. There are a lot of illegal things going on there, but otherwise, you wouldn't have economy, right? Income. So my question is more about like ethical protocols, or so for example, when you have like these new clusters or you are creating these alternatives to the system, and you see these pockets of hope or like people thriving. For example, I had an experience. I was working at a sustainable economy observatory with indigenous communities. And these women, they were breaking all the traditions of their community because women were forbidden of, they weren't allowed to work or to have economic income or independence. So when they started to join like cooperatives and they also start like a community system based on exchange, they start to thrive, but also they experience new challenges that they never faced before, like threats, for example, and extortion from gangs, like urban gangs and other like thieves or criminals. Like, oh, you are thriving now, so now every month you're gonna pay us this percentage of your income, otherwise we will kidnap someone from your family, etc., etc. So my question is like, have you noticed like these challenges, these new risks as well? And if you thought about, or if there's like any like protocol related to ethics, like for example, I don't know, like psychology, acompañamiento psicológico, like psychology, a service to help or to support people, or legal, like help with lawyers, or how to cope with these also possible threats. And yeah, and my other question that maybe is for all, like in the room, is that for me it's always pretty interesting how these alternatives, these economic alternatives, always represent a political threat to the mainstream system, right? And but also it's a little bit complicated or a little bit dangerous when you perceive these alternatives like degrowth, for example, degrowth only as a political movement and not as a economic right, like a basic right that we all have to express the way we want to do economy and the way it works for us. And it's funny as well because I went into a bookshop in London, a socialist bookshop, and I saw lots of big road books, and they were all in the section of politics and not in the section of economy. And I was like, well, we should also see it as how can we start like that, like to break this thin line between, is it more a political movement or is just another way of economy? So that was like my other question. And that's it. Thank you so much for the presentation.
No, thanks, Sophia. When we're working with groups like in refugee camps or even in some urban areas where there's like violence around, usually we're doing what we call this, we learned it in Uganda, it's called the visionary approach, and we bring as many people in the community together as possible and try to do kind of visionary work, which is basically like, what are plans for that community? Try to bring everyone as much on board as possible into individual planning visions for what they want in their family, as well as group visions in the community. And then we do a lot of resource mapping, and look at kind of gaps and resources in the community, and violence will be one of those often. And if we look at what are possible resources around that, like providing things like security, those will be things as well, that the community will look at resourcing those things. So we've had youth groups form as like neighborhood watch security and things like that as well. They're not dealing with, militarized groups coming in with guns though. That's another, whole scale. There's a guy in Colombia that's working on the border of Venezuela with some paramilitary groups as well. He's doing some interesting work there. So anyways, so that's kind of our vernacular. We go through this kind of, usually it's something like a initial like kind of 3-day training, and then we keep checking in on those groups and where they are. So you end up with kind of like vision here and kind of their resources and what they can kind of start to commit to here. And then we sort of like imagine that as a tension. They want to be here, but they're here. How do we bring from here to there, kind of like a rubber band? And then we look at, what is the what is the form where those commitments can be kind of transparently offered to each other in a safe way and fairly exchanged with each other. And often we go to, like in South America, the most common term for this is the minca or minga. And that's the same tradition as this as well. So if we can find that indigenous or ancient tradition, that's even better, because we can say, well, how did your ancestors coordinate your resources? Well, they somehow were able to fairly exchange with each other in some ways. And so security services could be part of that exchange as well. There could be all kinds of named services. The transparency in the network is a big thing right now. It's possible to do private versions of these networks, but there's some transparency. It's not, you don't know who's who within the, like the diagram I showed you, but like, if there's a lot of routing to particular addresses that are extortion going on, well, that's very noticeable in the network as well. So something good about sort of, on the side of radical transparency, in terms of being able to look at things like that. But I would say mostly, for the most part, we are starting with things like existing trust networks. We're never going into a place where there's nothing. I mean, I don't think that exists, but we're always, whenever we're in a place, we're working with church groups or we're working with small business networks that are like cooperatives, like doing cacao in Peru, where it's already functional. They're already functionally in some sort of trust and credit with each other. And we're just making that transparent. So that's, to me, what the protocol is about. It's just going into networks and saying, how do you already trust each other? How do you do that? How do you do resource coordination? Okay, great. Can we kind of operationalize that, like make a functional mechanism for like commenting and then connect at the edges, right? So like, okay, this is a good functional network. We can see what's going on here. Now, how do we connect out to Tom or Tom's network? What does that look like? So how do you federate across those? So, and then the other side I would just say is that, a lot of, we've tried to, like, on one side, there's the sort of like the violin, there's the instrument of the articulation of the pool and the protocol. It's a very simple object, like a screwdriver or a cup. You say, okay, well, what do you do with that cup? Right? Like, even as an individual, like say you make your own pool, how do you govern your own pool? How do you express limits on offers? Like, how much of Benedict's time would you be able to accept for your own? Or how much money could would you accept for, or various offers that you can make? Like, how do you decide your own offers? And then how do you do that as a community? And I learn a lot from things like Peter Levine and like trauma-informed therapy. That's been a huge for us, because we deal a lot of like traumatized groups, that it's very, very hard to trust each other or even yourself in some situations. Nonviolent communication, I think, is wonderful. I would call it compassionate communication. That's I like a lot of the work of Prosocial. They combine a lot of that into kind of commenting practices. So I think there's a lot of really beautiful, and the guy that I mentioned in Colombia, Juan Lopez, he's doing what he calls Franciscan economics. So he does it from a Franciscan lens, which is really interesting. It's really, actually, Franciscan economics is a kind of a beautiful side of kind of Benedictine kind of Christian thinking. So yeah, I think that that's what we're looking for often, is like, okay, here's a language where, or like a gene that that's being expressed in different places. How would you express it in those communities? How, and I don't think, we're not trying to peddle answers for that. It's just more like community of practice. Yeah.
Thank you, Will, for these wonderful answers. Aviv, you're muted, Aviv, sorry.
Can't do that. Thank you so much. It's been massively interesting and inspiring, actually, this work, and thought-provoking. We sort of maybe already answered my question. It's that maybe if you have anything more to say about it, about the trust, and especially not the kind of formal protocol aspect of it, but more the relational aspect of it, and if there's any thoughts you have in with relationship to culture, trust, relationality within the work that you're doing. That's kind of what I'm interested to hearing about, and specifically if there are any frictions and challenges that you found well, just in these processes of people adopting, people joining in, people trusting. So that's kind of, if you feel like you've said everything you have to say about it, that's
No, it's a good question. Yeah, in terms of like procedurally going into like a group that already has some sort of nominal trust with each other, there's some like kind of just procedural, like, okay, what are your visions? Like, how do we how do we create commitments that we believe are going to be fulfilled? What's the capacity of everyone? Like, if they already kind of have gelled somehow and they know each other well enough, or they've worked with each other, like a Rotary Club, that parts can be somehow easy. Like businesses are able to like come up with business contracts with each other quite easily. It might not be the same kind of compassionate trust that we're looking for, but it at least creates kind of a space that's already there. But I notice a lot when we're working with groups that don't have that gelling, the biggest part of the work we do is just creating a framework for them to listen to each other. And that's where I really love the nonviolent communication work. And there's a bunch of spin-offs of that in the last, many years, where, you're trying to move from, judgmental listening and communication into kind of empathetic listening. And, you have very similar protocol to what we use in commitment pooling. So instead of so we talk about curation, valuation, limitation, and exchange, and they talk about what you guys probably know this better than I, but you have looking for needs. So it's kind of like identifying, it starts with observations, like what's going on in the community or that person, right? Like without judgment, just like, I hear you saying this, or I've seen your business doing this, or yada yada. Okay, great. There's feelings, which is kind of like valuation in our framework. You're like, what is the value of that? How does it feel to you? What are the feelings you're hearing from the other person? Then you go into needs, which often is expressed as limits, right? So if we're in a pool system here and Tom says, I have, I'm offering these and I need money, well, he'll express how much money that would be. That would be sort of the limit, or the limit of how much he can offer. So expressing needs, and then going in and expressing like clear requests, right? Like what is it that we can actually do? Like, and that gets into like the exchange kind of part of our protocol too. So I really like the mapping between nonviolent communication and commitment pooling in that sense. And I think that you create an environment there where people feel listened to, where they can express feelings, they can hear other people's feelings as well. And that sort of transparency, even just on the interpersonal level, is very similar in some ways to the pool network, because what you're doing is you're expressing and exchanging services and offers with each other with relational memory, right? So it creates this environment that enables trust to happen. And I think of, I love the work of, I can't think of his name right now, but he's the one who did Promise Theory, Mark Burgess. And in Promise Theory, he's a very, a computer scientist guy, but he talks about he's a physicist like me as well. So he talks about like potential trust and kinetic trust, and like these kind of cycles where like you have potential trust for someone, maybe there's an environment for it, but then you build kinetic trust over time by witnessing, experiencing, having memory, like, oh, I've talked to you 5 times now, Aviv, like we're getting to be friends. We know about each other. Like it feels good. And it's just okay. You can get a sense of it. And like even with this group of CERN and stuff like this, like there's this sense of like, okay, we're all working on similar stuff. And like we respect each other, and we're, starting to interact with each other. And, right now that probably looks like a bunch of bilateral little connections. And if we can kind of pull that into a pooling network, then we can say, oh, okay, well, there's actually a lot of resources available in the CERN network. Oh, well, maybe we can collectively apply for a grant with those resources, right? Like it creates a space for us to do all kinds of stuff. And I've experienced that with one of our biggest groups right now. It's probably $170,000 of assets within their pooling system. And it was just a group of researchers and some NGOs that were part of a foundation that ended. It was called Mustard Seed. And they're working on doing exactly that. And that's been really just powerful to, there was some trust there already, but then it was kind of like having that trust transparent and kind of operational, like this kind of functional mechanism for commenting together. Go ahead, Nadia.
I don't know how to get the yellow hand on on the screen. So, well, thank you, Will. This has been very helpful to update all this sort of stuff. And I have a question regarding the challenges. You sent out a blog, and in one of your posts, it was called Murmuration. You mentioned that if a person in Kenya can be approached, that they get some kind of benefits. I didn't really understand what kind of benefits they were, but they are approached, they can get some benefit if they're poor, let's say, but if they admit that they are part of a Mweria or of some kind of Rola or Roska, then they are no longer eligible for this benefit, and they are told that they are not the poorest of the poor, that they have some some backup, and the result, you say in the blog, is that they actually either don't admit they're in the Mweria or they dismantle it. So this seems very disturbing. To what extent is this actually happening, and who is the institution which is giving out these benefits, and how if you can say anything about this?
I just sent two links there. One is kind of the results of that now. So like that program's kind of coming to an end, and it's been really beautiful because basically what happened was that as USA died just this last year, or was killed, UNHCR, which is what runs a lot of the camps in Kenya, refugee camps, basically their budget was completely slashed. And so they said, we're only going to give money to the poorest of the poor. And if you are in any form of mutual aid group, you're not poor anymore. And so it was like, this really insane way to think about it, right? And it really, like the whole thing of like creating victimhood, right? Like you must be the most victim, it really messed up. And so we had a lot of people hiding what they were doing. We had to basically we have reports that come in from those groups, and so they had to kind of change how they did their report format to make sure that it wasn't that the Red Cross, the UNHCR wouldn't identify them. And that program, like all that money UNHCR had, is now gone, right? So that was the end of their money. And what's been beautiful now is that these programs are the only thing that are still operating, right? So we outlasted them. And so there's a lot of we've seen it many times with like cash transfer programs and whatnot, where like people have to claim extreme poverty, and being part of a mutual aid group is considered a threat to the NGO world because they're not now treating the poorest of the poor, or like these people might not need them as much anymore and whatnot. And it's a complicated issue, but I think the results have been quite beautiful. And we had a survey done just this last year that was really beautiful results. And I think it's linked on that link I sent. There might be another, I'll stick here that has those survey results. So that's turned out well. But yeah, there's little bumps here and there. And that was a heartbreaking one. And there was a lot of like bad stuff happening at like there still is. I mean, a lot of drought, and it's quite tough. But wonderful that they're sort of going back to a lot of these practices. It's called GOOB in Somalia, the same practice, and SLA in Burundi, and they're all mixed together and they're in those practices, and there's a lot of camaraderie and just realization that they are the means for their own change, and that begging to the aid organizations just isn't sustainable. And I think that's becoming more and more and more apparent to everybody. So
Well, I'm glad to hear that it survived this attack, really, that the system survived this.
Yeah.
So a couple of people have had to leave, and they say thanks for the thanks for the session. And yeah, Will, thanks for sharing your insights. There's one question from Songzi in the chat, which is whether you see commitment pooling protocol being implemented in connection with natural conservation or any forms of human nature relations.
Yeah, that's maybe one of the other kind of biggest things we do is we work on kind of ecosystem programs, and Odd is our director of that, and she'd be lovely to talk with about how that works. But basically, we create lending pools, right? These kind of pools of assets that can have money or community resources, and access to those pools is based on certification that you're doing restorative practices, right? So it's not like, in other words, you can take out a loan for farming, but not just any kind of farming. You need to do swales, some water catchments. You're not going to just do, chop and burn everything. So she's been having a lot of good results with that. And then also like that the the data and like certification of those actions are also things that are valuable. And we work with a group called EcoCerts as well, that actually tries to get things like everything from carbon credit markets and whatnot to basically also reward those pools for those actions as well, right? So that's been a nice kind of like, think of the money going into those pools as sort of like a flywheel. And we see like, for every dollar going into those types of systems, we see at least $10 to $20 worth of rotation and, community action on top of all of that as well. So it's, to me, it's the most effective form of aid is, basically just trying to build up mutual aid. Oh. And by the way, Nadia, we have the book is out in French, and it's just about to be out in Spanish as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's
yeah.
great.
It's been really interesting trying to translate as well. A lot of discussions like, what is a commitment pool in Spanish? And we've gone through, I don't even know what the current term is, but that is something, it was something like something of trust. It was like a bowl of trust or something like this. And yeah, really fun.
Okay, so yeah, Bavia needs to get going as well. Thanks so much, Will, for enriching talk and discussion. She has your book now and can't wait to read it. Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really lovely practical complement to this talk, I think, because there's lots of great imagery and beautiful artwork, and yeah, it's a really nice text. So I look forward to seeing that translated as well. If there's any remaining questions, please just shout. Will, if there's anything else you'd like to add as well, I'll just leave it open. Tomorrow there is a session, Oliviana's session on Roscas. So I think that'll be interesting. It's a digital open source platform, Rosca platform from the UK, which I don't really know anything about, but I think it ties in with this, and I think it could be an interesting complement. And then there's also a session on community economies and digital technologies, which I think also is really, really relevant to this, and how yeah, technologies and relationships sort of merge and come together, and yeah, how interesting that could be in all the work Will has been doing. So yeah, Will, I'll leave with you, and if anyone else wants to pipe in the chat or anything also.
I was just going to say that like implementing this stuff without technologies, where it all came from and possible in lots of ways. Even just in the book, the second section, I don't actually talk about a technical implementation. I talk about using little pieces of paper or memory. So interesting to just play through those concepts, and again, like the Rosca, if you can see the protocol under the Rosca in this way, then it produces the ability for federation. And so like that's, to me, that's really the thing. It's not about this being something new. It's just about having a protocol language for connecting commons together. And I think that's exciting because I don't really know of anything like that. At least I mean, there's some various versions of that, but they're kind of implemented at a very high level for very like specific things like routing stocks in a stock exchange and stuff like that. So having something at a kind of basic level that connects back to, indigenous practices, I think has been really fun. And it's helped given me a way to sort of hold that element of resource coordination ping out across things like nonviolent communication or trauma-informed therapy or path work or all these kind of different protocols and modalities, and say like, well, what's that space of human coordination and living systems? And so it's been really useful for me to kind of hold that and learn from that perspective. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Okay, so yeah, thanks, Will. I'm gonna clap here and just say thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Yeah, everyone's really grateful, and this is so enriching and just the start of thinking about what you're doing and exploring your work and everything. So I'll stop the recording there, and yeah, have a great day, everyone.
Right.
Thank